Hey, how's it going guys? It's Nate here. And on this channel, over the past few years, we've quite literally explored hundreds of different Skyrim and Elder Scrolls mysteries. To why the dwarves disappeared, to what caused Winterhold's great collapse, to how come we can't visit Atmora anymore. Chances are, if there's a question about Skyrim, we've analyzed it on this channel. However, one unexplained event in Elder Scrolls lore always intrigued me more than the others. What happened to Uriel V, the Emperor that disappeared? So, if you're a longtime fan, you may have heard me briefly bring this question up before in one of my previous videos, and I think I may have spent a good 3 to 5 minutes explaining it. However, it's such a deep and complex conundrum, with such massive implications in the Elder Scrolls universe, that I've always wanted to do a full video dedicated to it, where I could lay everything out, all of the context, all of the theories, and what they might mean. Anyway, as you can probably guess, that's what this is. So, without any further ado, let's do further. Uriel was crowned at an unknown age in the year 268 of the Third Era, around 406 years prior to the events of the Elder Scrolls V, and 268 years after Tiber Septim's conquests. While the Septim Empire has been through some very turbulent times throughout its history, he inherited the throne at a fairly uneventful and prosperous moment. His father, Sepphoris, the previous ruler, had just put down a pretty major uprising and greatly expanded the imperial military by the time he passed away, leaving the young Uriel with a powerful and united kingdom at his disposal. The Third Empire was also already in control of pretty much all of Tamriel, from the northern shores of Skyrim to the glittering Somerset Isles. However, the 17th Emperor was still eager to make a name for himself, not wanting to squander the brilliant opportunity afforded to him with all this prosperity. So, he worked up to build a powerful navy, and set out to conquering a number of islands around Tamriel, that up until now, no emperor had ever been able to subdue. And he was remarkably successful, apparently. We don't know a whole lot of the finer details. In fact, we don't even know what most of the islands he took over look like on a map. Seriously, no clue how big, small, or even what shape they were. But according to the Brief History of the Empire, Book 3, most of these islands were located either north of Tamriel in the Sea of Ghosts, or far off Tamriel's eastern shores in the Padomaic Ocean. Whatever the case, these victories made Uriel very popular back at home. Many were beginning to consider him the greatest military mind since Tiber Septim. It's important to note, all of the in-game books we have about him really hammer this point home. Uriel Septim V was an emperor loved by his people and his soldiers, and was apparently a genius. Well, after conquering a strange landmass called Ezronay, that's quote-unquote a few weeks east of Tamriel by ship, Uriel decided that he was done with islands. He decided that his next military campaign would be to conquer Akavir itself. And this is where things get really weird. So, just in case you're out of the loop, Akavir is the mysterious other continent that's said to exist east of Tamriel across the Padomaic Sea. Stories and tales of it are shrouded in myth and legend, but evidently it's just as large, if not larger than Tamriel itself, and is home to monkey people, ice demons, venomous snake men, and more. Unfortunately, like all of those islands Uriel was gobbling up, there are no existing maps of Akavir we players are aware of, so anything you see is just a fan artist's depiction. Heck, we're not even sure how far away from Tamriel it is. Regardless, the lack of definitive knowledge about the place served as motivation for Uriel rather than a deterrent. And so, while on Ezronay, which is again a few weeks east of Tamriel in the Padomaic Sea, and therefore somewhere between Tamriel and Akavir, Uriel began planning an invasion. Over the next year or so, supply lines were established, more ships were built, soldiers were recruited, and there was allegedly even an extensive amount of magical reconnaissance done ahead of time. Our primary source for all of this preparation and what would follow is the book Report, The Disaster at Ionith, which is, or was a report commissioned by what was left of the Emperor's Elder Council after the Akavir invasion, to figure out what went wrong and what happened to the Emperor. And yes, spoiler alert, in case it wasn't already obvious, seen as our best source for all of this is a report about what went wrong, you can probably guess what fate Uriel's upcoming adventure would lead him to. But I digress. Evidently, at least according to the report's authors, the Emperor really didn't skimp on planning this thing. He was careful to make sure he had extra grain to feed his armies, made sure the Imperial mages doing the magical scouting were being triple checked, and even had some extra legions in reserve just in case things went sour. As far as we can tell, despite how foolish it seems to try to land an army in such a mysterious place, Uriel V was doing his homework, and was being cautious. Again, we don't have maps, so we can't get into specifics, but the Emperor and his staff ultimately determined that their initial landing in Akavir would be on a coast controlled by the Tsaesci, or the Snake People. These would be the first folks Uriel aimed to conquer. It's critical we understand who the Tsaesci are in order to really grasp the situation at hand, and knowing their lore is essential to some of the theories we're going to dive into a bit. So let's spare a moment to talk about this strange race before going any further. Lucky us, among the numerous organisms said to inhabit Akavir, the Tsaesci are probably the ones we know the most about. Even if we're missing a lot of crucial details, and that doesn't really mean anything. The book, Mysterious Akavir, which was written by an anonymous author and first appeared in the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind, describes the Tsaesci as being terrifying yet beautiful in appearance, boasting golden scales and sharp fangs. Allegedly, they even have an almost vampire-like lust for blood, having apparently killed all of the human beings who lived on Akavir thousands of years ago, and now they survive off of the blood of enslaved goblins. Accounts vary on their exact body structure. Some say they look relatively human, just scaly, while other texts allege that they slither around on giant tails and possess shape-shifting capabilities. Regardless, despite so much left vague, the Tsaesci played a surprisingly important role in Tamriel's own history, as in the year 2703 of the First Era, roughly 1,000 years before Uriel's ascension to the throne, they invaded Tamriel. Yeah, that's right. Believe it or not, the Tsaesci did what Uriel wants to do, and came over here. The assault began as their forces landed on the northern shores of Skyrim, and started to fight their way down south to Cyrodiil. Mind you, this was 1,000 years ago, way back in the First Era, when Skyrim and Morrowind were both their own independent kingdoms, and the second, not the third, Cyrodiilic Empire was just getting started. The denizens of Tamriel were about as shocked by this attack as you can possibly imagine. I mean, just waking up one day to see legions of possibly vampiric, possibly slithering armies of snake people you never even knew existed would be quite the baffling event. To them, it was like an alien attack. To this day, it's unclear what the Tsaesci wanted. Some argue they came only to find humans so they could drink our blood, others argue they wanted new territory. But it's still unknown. But as they prepared to cross the Geralt Mountains and leave Skyrim to enter Cyrodiil, the army was met by Riemann Cyrodiil, the then Emperor, and also founder and namesake of the Second Cyrodiilic Empire, who happened to be a Dragonborn. As Riemann's and the Akaviri forces began to clash, before the fighting got really bloody, at some point in time, Riemann used his Dragonborn abilities to dragon shout at the Akaviri army. And much to his pleasant surprise, the Snake People all immediately surrendered and submitted. As soon as they heard his voice, they gave up. They must have known what a Dragonborn was, and held the position in high regard. After this event, most of the lizards just went back home, and didn't bother anyone again. Though some chose to stay, and serve this Dragonborn Emperor. These Tsaesci were the founders of the Blades, the Emperor's personal bodyguard and special forces, that would go on to serve every remaining Dragonborn Emperor. The Blades, of course, would become a pretty influential organization in Tamriel on their own, And while their membership over the years would include fewer and fewer Tsaesci, eventually becoming entirely Tamrielic in racial makeup, they'd still play a pivotal role in quite a few Elder Scrolls games, before being destroyed by the Thalmor in the Great War, and possibly rebuilt by the Dragonborn in Skyrim, depending on how much you like Delphine and company. Anyway, while I'd love to spend more time talking about the Blades and the Akaviri invasion of Tamriel, we'll get back to all of this later. For now, just understand that the Tsaesci are mysterious folk, shrouded in myth, yet also clearly quite advanced and civilized, seen as they were capable of organizing an invasion of Tamriel. And they're who Uriel V wanted to conquer first. Thus, after months of planning, he finally went into motion. On the 23rd of Rain's Hand, in the year 288 of the Third Era, Uriel finally departed from Ezronay, and after sailing roughly 4 weeks east, he and 4 veteran Imperial legions finally saw the shores of Akavir. Their landing site was a large Tsaesci coastal city that sat on the mouth of a river. Evidently, the Emperor chose it thanks to its close proximity to Tamriel's supply lines, and the fertility of nearby land. While Uriel and his generals expected to storm the city and capture it, the Imperials were pleasantly surprised to find the place totally abandoned when they showed up, and the forces were able to disembark with absolutely no resistance. It would seem the natives must have known the Empire was coming ahead of time, and retreated further inland. Either way, Uriel was just happy to finally be on dry land. The newly occupied city was renamed Septimia, the first Imperial colony of Akavir, and Uriel immediately had the engineers begin fortifying the city's defenses and expanding its port to better suit the Imperial fleet. From here, the Emperor took all 4 of his legions and marched inland upriver, leaving behind just a small garrison. According to a report, the Akaviri countryside was full of well-watered fields and various natural resources. This was great news, seen as the Empire would be able to start planting crops and collecting harvests, as well as mine metal, and wouldn't be so dependent on overseas supply lines. Eventually, the legions encountered another recently abandoned city upriver and occupied it, renaming the place Ionith. Remember, that report is called The Disaster at Ionith. Just some food for thought. Anyway, the city was much larger than Septimia, so Uriel decided to make it his Akaviri capital. This would be the new headquarters of the expedition. From here, with 2 large settlements secured and only 4 legions, the Imperials decided to focus on building up logistics and defenses while they awaited reinforcements. Legionnaires went to work constructing roads between Septimia and Ionith, as well as building small forts and guard posts on the way. Things were largely going well, though they finally began encountering some resistance, as Tsaesci raiding parties started to harass the soldiers as they built roads, and supply caravans as they moved between the 2 towns. Some started to call on the Emperor to keep pressing inland, to keep the snake folk in the apparent retreat they were already in when the invasion began, and hopefully even score a decisive victory. However, Uriel was still unsure of the exact size of the enemy he was facing, and he knew that he had more troops which would be arriving soon. So instead, for now, the Emperor opted to start dispatching emissaries and ambassadors to, quote, contact the Tsaesci king, or whoever ruled this land, end quote. It looks as though the Emperor was hoping to just convince the natives to surrender some land and avoid bloodshed altogether. Regardless, the report suggests that virtually none of these diplomats ever made it back, and it appears no one was ever able to figure out what was governing the Snake People anyway. Sometime in the year 289, a major setback occurred, when just a few days after a large shipment of thousands of civilian colonists landed in Akavir, the weather on the sea took a turn for the brutal, and became incredibly violent and stormy. It would get so bad that the ships had to just stop traveling altogether, totally cutting off the expeditionary force from its supply lines, and any hope of those reinforcements. Alas, this would merely be the first in a series of unfortunate events and tremendous setbacks that would ultimately lead to Uriel's doom. Despite losing any hope of recovering supplies, there was still quite a bit of optimism within the Imperial ranks. I mean, this was incredibly fertile land they were occupying. They'd simply just have all the new civilian colonists start farming. Problem solved. But then, temperatures started to cool, and within months, they started to freeze. Farming would have to wait. Now, with thousands of additional civilian mouths to feed, the Imperials were forced to depend totally on the grain reserves they had already brought with them, and rations were getting tight. To make matters worse, Tsaesci attacks were getting even stronger, as they started to totally overrun forts and guard posts between Septimia and Ionith, and blizzards were forcing the Empire to just straight up abandon some positions. When the weather finally did get warmer months later, to everyone's horror, spring brought a terrible dry wind, rather than rain. Crops would fail yet again. It got so hot that the river which connected Septimia and Ionith dried up entirely. With a now very spooky food situation and storms ravaging the seas, the Imperials resorted to a desperate plan. You see, vessels could make it across the ocean from Akavir to Tamriel if they had a handful of very skilled battle mages aboard. As, fortunately enough Imperial mages were capable of accurately predicting weather patterns, and just slightly changing them, just enough to help a small number of ships slip through, back and forth. It wasn't a lot of food Uriel would be able to get, but he needed anything. Once he sent the battle mages to sea, our details on what exactly happened next in Akavir start to get really shady, as it was the battle mages who were the ones actually writing stuff down, and telepathically communicating with the Elder Council back in Tamriel. The ones that remained with Uriel's men were very busy, creating water for the army to drink, something they were never particularly trained to do, and required a tremendous amount of magicka. What we do know is that a few months into the summer, a large Tsaesci army was sighted just a few miles from Ionith. Uriel decided to march out with all 4 of his legions to confront the host, and he actually decisively smashed it, totally destroying the Tsaesci force. However, as he and his men were chasing down the survivors, another, even larger Tsaesci army appeared, and the Imperials were forced to retreat back behind Ionith's walls, suffering massive casualties before they were besieged. At this point in time, full panic mode was activated. It's unclear today how large this besieging Tsaesci army was, but considering it forced 4 of the Empire's most experienced legions to retreat behind walls, it must have been huge. This is also when Uriel and his forces totally stopped communicating with the outside world. His mages were just too preoccupied magically creating food for the men and fighting off assaults to spend any energy communicating. And he sure as Oblivion couldn't get any of his messengers to sneak through enemy lines. For months, Ionith was apparently being besieged, and the Elder Council who was running things back in Tamriel started working on a plan to get the legions and their emperor out of there. Sometime in the year 290, a small group of ships was able to slip through the storms and made it to the port city of Septimia, which apparently was also being besieged too, though by a smaller Tsaesci army. The Elder Council figured that if Uriel and his men could break out from Ionith, and then break through the army that was besieging Septimia too, they could make it into the city and be evacuated. Ravens were dispatched to Ionith giving the Emperor this plan, and what we know next comes from the few survivors who would make it back home. Towards the end of the year, the entire Imperial army rushed from the gates of Ionith, and successfully broke through the enemy lines, before they started rushing down the road to Septimia. But before Uriel and his 4 legions could make it, they were surrounded and overran by Tsaesci forces. A heroic last stand was made, which allowed a few hundred soldiers to escape to Septimia, but not the Emperor, nor most of his officers. 2 soldiers reported watching him get struck down by arrows as he rallied a shield wall. This is the last known account of Uriel V. The survivors who made it to the port city, as well as the rest of that city's small garrison, quickly boarded on the ships and escaped to Tamriel, before that city too was probably retaken by the Tsaesci. And thus was the end of Imperial activity in Akavir. Somewhere around 40 to 70,000 people went on that expedition, from soldiers to officers to civilians, and only a few hundred returned. One of the greatest tragedies the Septim Empire would ever suffer. With the Emperor presumed dead, his 5-year-old son assumed the throne, and the long process of mourning and rebuilding began. Okay, so this is all a great sad story. A tale of a magnificent emperor who let his overambition get to his head and paid the ultimate price for it. But where's the mystery in all this I promised? I mean, 2 Imperial soldiers clearly reported that they saw their Emperor get struck down by arrow fire. Uriel died. He's not missing like the title of my video claims. Well, before I get to the really damning stuff, I should say that players have been theorizing Uriel V's survival for years now. Remember how 1,000 years ago the Tsaesci invaded Tamriel, and they were ultimately stopped when Riemann Cyrodiil revealed to them he was a Dragonborn, causing all of the Tsaesci to lay down their arms and submit? Well, Uriel V was also a Dragonborn himself. Indeed, all of the Septim Emperors were. He possessed the same shouting powers. Perhaps those 2 Imperial soldiers who report seeing the Emperor get shot down by arrow fire were just wrong, or maybe they were liars. Maybe, while making that heroic last stand, after all the other soldiers escaped, the Emperor shouted once or twice. And maybe that caused the Tsaesci to lay down their arms and submit. Or maybe the Emperor did get hit with a couple of arrows, but they didn't kill him, they just caused him to fall unconscious. And after the battle was over and the Tsaesci recovered his body, they realized he was a Dragonborn, and changed their minds a bit. If Uriel V somehow survived the disaster at Ionith, this has some incredibly huge implications on the Elder Scrolls' lore, because it means that the Septim bloodline of Emperors might not be gone after all. You see, at the conclusion of the events of the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, the last member of the Septim Dragonborn bloodline, a man named Martin Septim, dies sacrificing himself to save Tamriel from a Daedric invasion. With the Septims all gone, following a brief internal power struggle, the Mead family emerged on top, and became the new rulers of the Septim Third Empire. However, because there was no longer a Dragonborn Emperor sitting on the throne, the Empire lost the divine protection of Akatosh, the god of dragons, and things got really bad. The Red Mountain in Morrowind erupted, causing a massive crisis. The Thalmor began gathering power and eventually defeated the Empire in the Great War, and now the Imperial province of Skyrim might break away, depending on the player's actions in the Elder Scrolls V. But assuming Uriel V survived at Ionith, and assuming he had children, or I don't know, just stayed alive via magical means, it would mean there's still a Septim out there. And if that person could be put back on the throne, maybe Tamriel's current downspin could be turned around. This sounds like a crazy crackpot theory, but here's the thing I've been waiting to tell you all this time. This crazy idea I've proposed, in which Uriel somehow survived the disaster at Ionith and could one day return to Tamriel to take back his throne and restore the Septim bloodline to the Empire, well, that was originally the plot for the Elder Scrolls V, at least while the game was in pre-production. Speaking to staff of the unofficial Elder Scrolls pages during an interview at PAX East 2019, Todd Howard said this when asked about fan theories. Quote, "I think that they're all good. Like I said there, people want to know the truth. But even my perspective is one version of the truth of what happened in the history of the Elder Scrolls and so forth. I would tamper their desire to have all mysteries revealed, because mysteries are good for a fantasy world to have. What is beyond the ocean? Would you do a game in Akavir? These are all things we have thought about. I could sit here and tell you lots about Akavir. Actually, one of the original Skyrim designs had, I think it was Uriel V returning, with his army of dragons from Akavir to retake his throne. But it was sort of like, keep the mysterious lands mysterious. There's enough to do in Tamriel proper. As time goes on, I like to have those elements of mystery, or really strange things you can't wrap your head around." End quote. So, there you have it. At one point, Skyrim's plotline wasn't supposed to center around Alduin and Paarthurnax and the great battle for the World Eater, but instead was supposed to center around the return of Uriel V from Akavir. He survived. In fact, this is why I think so many of our sources from the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion are so careful to paint him in a good light. Back when Bethesda was making TES 4, they already knew, or suspected, that they might want to have Uriel V play a big part in Skyrim. So, when they were writing books about him, they were careful to make sure he was presented as a good guy, because perhaps they were preparing to make him a protagonist. Another important part about Todd Howard's quote that I don't want to forget is that he mentions Uriel V returning with an army of dragons. Somehow he got those. I mean, Akavir's name does literally translate into Dragonland. However, the people of Skyrim had always assumed the dragons in Akavir had all been killed thousands of years ago. Apparently not. Apparently, they must still be there. Another interesting question is, how did Uriel V survive all this time? I mean, the events of Skyrim take place over 600 years following his assumed death. So how did he live? Well, one of the dominions of Akatosh, the god of dragons, whom Uriel V is technically a child of, is time. Maybe dragon magic somehow kept him ageless. I think this could be an incredible plotline for Bethesda to perhaps exercise sometime in the future. I mean, so often when we talk about the Elder Scrolls 6, most people just assume that game will all be about a second great war between the Empire and the Dominion. But perhaps by the time that game starts, the realms of men will have already been conquered by the High Elves, and the game's plot can revolve around Uriel V returning and righting those wrongs. I don't know, that's just an idea of mine. Nonetheless, despite being such an incredible narrative that so few people in the Elder Scrolls community know about, Bethesda ultimately did decide not to use this plotline, and therefore, at least canonically speaking, the fate of Uriel V does remain a mystery. Looking at the timeline, we've already been in this video for well over 20 minutes, so I feel like this is a good point to wrap up on. Thanks so much for stopping by, everybody. What do you think happened to Uriel V? Do you think he really was cut down by arrows and that was the end of that? Or do you think he'll return in a future Elder Scrolls game or DLC? Maybe he revealed his Dragonborn powers and the Tsaesci made him a king of sorts. Whatever your ideas, leave them in the comment section down below. I'd love to know your thoughts. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and hope to catch you all in my next video. Peace out, everyone.